The changes that took place in the Roman Empire in the 4th century were some of the most important and far-reaching in human history. Sandwiched in between the crises of the 3rd and 5th centuries, the relative peace and prosperity of the 4th century coincided with the transformation of Rome from a largely pagan to a largely Christian society. This transition brought about a radical change in many aspects of life for the people of the empire, from the schedule and types of practical religious observance, to more deep-seated changes in concepts of morality and charity, individuals' relationship to the state, and expectations for the afterlife. The subject of Edward J. Watt's book The Final Pagan Generation is not the last holdouts of paganism in the empire. There continued to be pagans for centuries after the period covered in this book. The Emperor Justinian is supposed to have ordered the closure of the academy in Athens, or at least cut off public support, in 529 because it was considered an incubator of pagan thought. Rather, this book offers a glimpse of life for the last generation of Romans who were born and raised in an empire that was still overwhelmingly pagan in its public institutions and basic assumptions. They witnessed the last great persecution of Christians in the last years of Diocletian and came of age during the rise of state support for Christianity under Constantine. Further, this is not a book about the vast majority of the people in the Roman Empire. Outside of grave markings and the occasional letter that happens to survive, it's very difficult to know what the average Roman thought about anything. Instead, this book focuses on a certain type of elite Roman in the form of 4 men, both pagans and Christians: Libanius, Praetextatus, Themistius, and Ausonius. All were highly educated men who interacted with or actually served in high positions in the imperial government. Watts is very effective at setting the stage for the lives these men led and the kind of pagan atmosphere they took for granted, even as it slowly disappeared over the course of their lives. He's very evocative when describing the sights and smells of life in a Roman city of the 4th century. Any city of the empire would have had hundreds if not thousands of temples and shrines to the gods, large and small. The processions of godly statues would have been a common sight. The smell of sacrifices, both animal and incense, would have been everywhere. His description of the life of an elite student, which all 4 men were, is also quite funny. Relationships developed in young adulthood in a time of intense loyalty to specific schools and teachers continued throughout their lives. Students lived in a kind of chaotic anarchy that was at least tolerated by public authorities, despite violent clashes between rival students groups being common. As the century progressed and Christian emperors transitioned from a more passive opposition to pagan institutions to a more direct attack on them, Watts describes this generation as being strangely complacent about the disappearance of the world they had taken for granted, rooted in their inability to imagine a world fundamentally different from the one in which they grew up. He makes a convincing case that the laws Constantine passed against pagan sacrifice were essentially toothless, with no penalties enforced for breaking them. Later emperors would add teeth to these laws, but that didn't prevent pagan elites from working closely with them. Themistius, for instance, used his standing as a noted philosopher to declare in a fawning speech praising the Emperor Constantius II that as a philosopher he was bound to speak only as reason dictated. This kind of bald flattery of the ruling emperor was a requirement for public position and influence. Themistius was rewarded with a position in the Senate of Constantinople and a role in choosing other senators. Others in this group served as governors, consuls, ambassadors, and tutored the children of an emperor. Libanius comes alive in this book more than the others, perhaps inevitably due to the sheer amount speeches and letters of his that survive. The ups and downs of his career as a teacher and rhetorician, his constant contacts and rivalries with other elites, and his despair at the death of his son, makes for very engaging reading. It humanizes such a distant time and place and gives a personal view on the changes experienced by all the men studied in this book. His relationship to the famous Christian John Chrysostom, who may have been a student of his, and their separate attempts to obtain official pardon for their city of Antioch after a riot, provides an interesting view into the changing generational attitudes that began to harden divisions between elite pagans and Romans at the end of this period. The sudden rise of the pagan Julian as emperor was a shock to the system. His attempts to turn back the tide of Christianity managed to upset both pagan and Christian elites. One thing all elite Romans took very seriously was property law, and his decree that formerly pagan temples that had been turned over to new Christian owners be returned created confusion and anger without significantly increasing the appeal of paganism to a population that had been converting to Christianity for decades. Likewise, his attempt to ban Christians from teaching the pagan classics upset the relative comedy that existed among this generation. The education of illiterate Roman, even for Christians, relied heavily on pagan poetry and history. Julian soon died invading Persia, and these policies were quickly reversed, but his immediate successors continued a relatively tolerant policy towards paganism that allowed these men to continue their careers, their prominent place in society owing more to their connections to the ups and downs of imperial politics than to whether they were pagan or Christian. By the end of their lives the situation had changed. A new generation of assertive bishops like Ambrose of Milan had begun to take the place of the old educated elite in the councils of more stridently Christian emperors like Theodosius. The famous incident of the destruction of the Serapeum in Alexandria in 392 heralded a new era of life and thought that was alien to men of an earlier generation. These new men had come of age in a Christian empire, and had no nostalgic allegiance to the past that an older Christian like Ausonius had maintained.